Okay, so indeed, my name is Alex Gekker, or Gekker to my many Dutch friends who find it amusing. And today I'm going to be talking about, well, health games. And the interesting thing about my talk is that I'm going to be referencing two research projects that I did that were on the health games from a bit of a different perspective, that were on the concept of health games themselves and not necessarily what we usually understand as a research on health games. So let's start with an anecdote, because those are always fun. I was in Bremen in the end of September. Anybody here is from Bremen by chance? No? Lovely city, Germany. Has this statue, which I didn't see because I was between the hostel and the conference venue all the time, and I didn't have time to go through the city center, which is what you do when you go to a new city for a conference. And I was at the Serious Games Development and Application panel on health games, and this was the lineup for the panel, and you could see a curious thing of the speakers. You can see me doing the talk, and then you can see three other talks with a whole bunch of other people on each talk, growing progressively larger names until in the end there just seem to be more names of the speakers than names of the presentation itself. And that was rather strange to me. But then I realized, after sitting through all the talks, that the health games that were presented there were focused on a very highly focused on, well, medical teams. And in medical research, this is quite, it's common. You have lots of teams of people doing long research, and then you mention all the contributors. And I was the only guy coming from a more of a social sciences, humanities perspective who was trying to offer a glimpse into health games. And you'll see that this is tied quite strongly to the talk of my conference, the content of my talk. So, what I'm going to be doing today is talking very briefly about how games are everywhere. Then I'll be presenting also briefly two research projects that I mentioned before. One which was used for which I did for mapping the serious gaming industry or applied games industry as an industry. So I looked at applied games as an industry, as a process, as a system. And the second research is also a sort of mapping project that I did, but which focused not on the industry as a whole, but on the games themselves, and were about health games in Europe. And in the end, I will try to talk a bit about the future, but we all know that this never works well. So I will probably try to suggest what we can do in the future and not really predict it. So here we go. We are entering an age, and I know that you're probably already quite bored of hearing it, because it seems like every speaker here mentions it in one way or another, but we are entering an age where games are commonplace. So games are embedded in the popular culture, in the technology industry, in people's leisure time, in a way that they were never did, and I mean digital computer games, because games always existed. And it has to do not only with the mind-boggling amounts of games and the revenues that this industry produces, but also with what I called in work I produced in my master thesis, the gamocracy, which, by the way, this very lovely cover, which merges between Frontierville and the anonymous Guy Fawkes mask, was designed by Kalina, who's sitting here in the audience, so I want to thank her. So what I call a gamocracy, and this is a state where, and I talked here about politics and political communication, but I see it everywhere, where games are becoming the mainstream point of reference, the main cultural paradigm that our society is experiencing. And I won't go too deep into that because it took me whole master thesis to go into that, and I don't want to make it easy on you. But basically this quote by Eric Zimmerman, the game designer, when in an interview to Jesper Juhl, who wrote a book on casual games, and he says, as digital technologies, networks and information, the internet, computers, mobile technologies more and more pervade our lives, the ways in which we socialize and flirt and communicate and learn and work and do our taxes and engage with our government and manage our finances, for some reason it's finances, which is funnier, the more I think about our culture becomes pride for play, and particularly games as the most dominant form of leisure. Because games are the form of culture that is most intrinsically related to those things, to system, technology, information, and mediated communication. Play becomes a more dominant paradigm for culture rather than the moving image. And this is the last time that I read a slide from the screen. I know it's a big no-no, but I think this is an important enough quote that we could all concentrate on. And so this is basically my premise when I come to analyze and talk about serious games. Because games are in our pockets and in our computers and on our prime TV in the form of game shows, and the way that so embedded in the social fabric, which is Facebook, for example, which have become a second social nature to so many of the young generation, serious or applied games will eventually lose its meaning. And I say this is a good thing. This is something that we, people who are engaged in the serious gaming industry or in the applied game industry, should strive for. Because when this happens, when you're doing games and your game happen to have a health meaning, and nobody will question that, and I do believe that this will happen, then the talks about validation and the talks about serious versus non-serious game design or financing will disappear. And we already see it in some of the more, let's say, gamified approaches, maybe not games themselves, but gamified approaches to certain world problems, which sure you know and you heard here from people more interested than me. But let's do a short minigame about research, specifically about the two research projects that I mentioned before. And those were, at first, I mapped geographically, in a very physical sense of mapping the applied games as an industry, with also a bit of a contextual mapping, so geographic and abstract mapping. And the second one is actually the paper that I delivered in Bremen in September, which was called Health Games Taxonomy Analysis and Design Suggestions. First, we did a rather large, or attempted to do a rather large survey to identify serious games producers, users, and manufacturers, organizations, universities, and the like. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not 100% happy with the results because it turned out to be much more chaotic than we envisioned it. Not only in the terms of the results themselves, I mean, but in terms of the methodology and how we ended up getting those results. And what we obviously missed a lot of names, and we constantly, we have our list, and we constantly say, especially even when preparing this conference, we looked at the names and say, yes, of course, those are the guys that are here. How could we miss them in the first run? And it just keeps going. So we're going to do a second round of that, and then this is going to be much, much better and more substantial research. But what is interesting is that I noticed along the wide spectrum of serious games producers, two trends which seem to persist everywhere. One, games as products. These are the companies that used to do edutainment or used to do software, the developer companies. And they see their games as something that you have to build, that you tailor for certain audience. It has the value chain implications occasionally of software. It's built occasionally still on physical media, on selling boxed or digitally boxed goods. The other is games as campaigns, and these are the offshoots, all sorts of digital agencies who maybe got into games by doing advert games or doing digital campaigns, and they see serious games in completely different manner. And when you look at this like that, you see in these two ways that serious games are produced, there are the things that you don't see. And one thing is that the applied game industry has a very strange value chain, and it's barely possible to speak of a value chain at all when you have these two even conflicting, I'm saying two, there are more, but two general approaches to creating serious games. So publishers, studios, can we talk about this distinction, which we often use from the gaming industry? Are we talking, is it really, can we talk about business to business or business to consumer models with serious games? Do you know a lot of games that distinctly, a lot of applied games that distinctly fit into one of these categories? We found it very hard to categorize. There is something that David Nieborg from Amsterdam University calls branch serialization, which is the mainstream of gaming today. Branch serialization means that when you download, Call of Duty, then after a while you download the Call of Duty extra big guns digital content, DLC. And after a while you have the extra big guns DLC, and then you have Call of Duty 2, and then you have the Call of Duty 2 with more explosions DLC, and so forth and so on. The gaming industry is in a perpetual mode of pushing content, in a perpetual mode of delivering to its people, and this approach doesn't exist at all. Maybe besides several very anecdotal evidence in the serious gaming. There are very little global actors. There are small studios are mostly who drive in the innovation in serious gaming more often than not, and it has to do with the fact that small studios also produce games for mobile and are more agile and reliant on newer modes of production. And Europe as itself presents a very interesting case where health games specifically, because this is coming to the second research, are produced and are produced quite vibrantly, but in a very specific manner. And the second research that I did, which actually chronologically was before the first one, but it doesn't matter for this presentation, has to do with the Ben Sawyer taxonomy. Ben Sawyer is the founder of Games for Health movement in the United States, and he created this taxonomy which kind of charts what are the possibilities to do with health games. It is divided into fields and areas of applications. So I was very interested in this taxonomy. I was very interested in thinking about what health games exist before even looking at the market itself. So to kind of have the taxonomy as the way you have in many other, in sciences, where you have a taxonomy and you know before you start categorizing, so you already know where you're going to put them more or less. And I was also very interested in Ian Bogo's notion of procedural rhetoric, which if some of you were at Ben's opening workshop, you would know, but which basically what Bogos claims, and in most simplistic form, is that games as procedural system of rules can convey meaning and persuade you or educate you to do something by their gameplay mechanics, and not necessarily but any sort of content or message that is presented on the game. So a shooting game has a certain persuasive rhetoric about movement, about spatiality, when it doesn't matter what you shoot at or with what you shoot. What he explains it by games having a simulation gap or simulation fever, which is the gap between what the player perceives as the reality of the game and what the player perceives as his or her own reality. You got anti-meme, which is a rhetorical device in which you leave out something from an argument in order to convey your audience. For example, if I say he cannot be trusted because he is a politician, the anti-meme here is that all politicians are not to be trusted. In a similar way, Bogus says games living out certain procedural arguments, certain movement arguments or action arguments out of their system. And when you build in a city, in SimCity, then you know that, that you learn that cities have to have slums in order to be prosperous, because if you don't have slums, if you don't put industry next to urban zones, you don't have industry and the city is not prosperous, but the urban zones that you put next to industrial zones becoming slums. So in a way, SimCity is propagating a certain view on urban development and planning. And the third, so technically what I wanted to do, I wanted to look at the health games that are created in Europe. And we were interested in Europe because we're Games for Health Europe, and try to kind of sort them out according to their meaning, according to their procedural rhetoric, and fit them in Sawyer and Smith taxonomy. I wanted to look at existing game databases on health games. I found out that unfortunately those that exist, and there are a few, not sorted out according to the way that the analysis allows me to analyze it. So what I did is a snowball sampling of about 50 games, which from literature review we concluded that this is enough for a representative sampling. And these are the results. So for example, in the personal preventative field, which was by far the largest, it includes things like exergaming, brain training games. Those are games that are intended for personal use, for preventative purposes, so not therapeutic, not after disease, but in order to stay fit, in order to train yourself, which was not surprising. What was a bit more surprising was the fact that, I keep looking there, but I have a screen here. Somebody should remind me that. The fact that games for personal use were the dominant category. I was expecting to find much more games intended for training and for professionals. I didn't find that much. There were, but not as much as for personal use. And informatics, something that Ben Sawyer predicted, and this is a taxonomy from 2004, that Sawyer saw a need or predicted that will exist already 8 years ago, doesn't exist practically at all. And this is games that deal with the informatics, for example, games that allow access to personal health records in a certain way. We found anecdotal evidence at best. So what I wanted to say with that is that I found it, and if I go back for a sec for the previous category, my argument here is that a lot of it has to do with the fact that we don't have a procedural rhetoric of the multiplayer. That we are very good at analyzing games, and so reverse engineering, designing games that have the single player and the game as their main actors. But we don't really have models, and we don't have really understanding of persuasion or education of multiplayer games, where the player interacts not only with the game, but also with his or her peers. And therefore, there are very little games in the areas like informatics, in the areas like epidemiology, for example, which includes a very large number of participants and which cannot be easily simplified to just the interaction between the player and the computer. And this ties quite well with how the current applied game industry is structured in a way. Because if we're still thinking about games as products or games as campaigns, this is still a very, one versus one approach. So even when you think, even if you think about ad campaigns, and that which are supposed to be more multiplayer than just software products, an ad campaign still is a communication between the agency and the intended audience. You still think of it as a one-on-one interaction. And this, for me, this works. This explains a lot of why we don't see very many multiplayer games as well. So, as a bonus level of sorts, if I could give you one piece of advice, of course, sunscreen would be it. But if I could give you another one, asynchronous multiplayer would be it. And I'm more and more convinced as I look at the applied gaming and the mainstream gaming industries that the cure to a lot of the problems that, for example, Martin de Ronde was talking about this morning is through applying asynchronous multiplayer game design to health games. And why asynchronous? So when I talk about asynchronous multiplayer, I mean, on the one hand, things like Farmville and Words with Friends, which allow you to play with others, but not at the same time. But there are even more interesting examples, which I'll get to in a second. And the asynchronous multiplayer is the mode of play that is currently by far the most successful. Just looking at the majority of social games on Facebook and the platform and the mobile platforms, this is the mode that works, and this is also the mode that fits quite well with the applied game paradigm, and I'll explain why. For me, the idea of cooperation over time and distance is often what our classic modes of education are. I'm running out of time? No? Yeah? Yeah, okay. Okay, so that's the last slide, basically. So basically, I'll give two quick examples. No, sorry. One is Minecraft, where the deliberate asynchronous communication between players, if we're talking about the multiplayer version, or if we're talking about the single-player version, the hard-to-get ability into the game, creates a paratextual world around Minecraft, which includes wikis and guides, and where the world building is part of the procedural rhetoric of the game. So the game is about construction, the game is about creation, and in a sense, the community that arises around it is also about construction and creation and about problems in communications, because, again, the game doesn't communicate, at least in the early versions, didn't communicate itself rather well. The other example that I wanted to give really briefly is complete opposite, is Dark Souls for PlayStation. And what happened there is that the player was deliberately limited for having for interacting with other players. So you had a single-player game, but multiplayer was possible by leaving notes, which were also deliberately hindered in communication. So short notes, very concise messages, very enigmatic. Not enigmatic, but not you couldn't deliberate much in the message, but say, trap ahead or beware or treasure nearby. And this also created a very interesting communication between players, which didn't have to play at the same time, but nevertheless felt that there is a community around them and that other players are contributing to this conquest of this alien, strange, hostile environment, and fostered a certain type of communication and learning. That was my presentation. Thank you. Hope you have a great conference.